Okay, I think that's now streaming live, fingers crossed, as long as the technology hasn't failed me in one way or another. This is the first of hopefully a future series of live streamed conversations with people involved in Skotia, which is a new media group for a better Scotland. And we've mainly produced sort of shorter video content over the past few months with a range of people, mainly about Scotland, current affairs, and politics. And that's taken a slight change of direction with the global pandemic and shutdown across Scotland and various parts of the world. So we thought we would do something slightly different and start doing various forms of live stream on YouTube. So thank you very much for being some of the first people to log on and watch that. All six of you at the moment, according to the analytics I've got in front of me. Um, so that's very exciting. Um, that's probably four more people than you would usually be allowed to have in any outdoor gathering. So this is in itself an exceptional turn of events. At least if we can meet outside in a physical place, we can have these types of conversations and way of sharing information, sharing experiences, and sharing discussions. So thank you for being some of the first people to do that. Um, so yeah, thanks for watching. What I'm going to talk through today is explaining some of the lockdown laws in Scotland following coronavirus. So I'll talk through some of the ways in which the legislation will change how we live, what businesses can run, where can we go and why, um, who can we help, how often can we help people, and what new powers this is given to Police Scotland in terms of what they can do legally. Um, so first of all, the law came into force in Scotland, this specific law, at 7:15 p.m. on Thursday night. So it's called the Health Protection Coronavirus Restrictions Scotland Regulations 2020. That's quite a long mouthful description for a piece of legislation. And if this works properly, you should be able to see a link to that I've just put into the search bar um, beside the live stream. So that's quite handy if you want to follow along any of the information that I'm talking through as part of this live stream. So the type of law is made by the Scottish Government, and it's called the Scottish Statutory Instrument. So it's a piece of secondary legislation, sometimes it's called delegated legislation, and that's a power that the executive or the Scottish Government has to make um, as a subsidiary to an act of Parliament or an act of the Scottish Parliament. In this case, it's through Schedule 19 of the UK-wide Coronavirus Act 2020, which was recently passed. Now, this statutory instrument, a regulation, is a law like nothing we've ever seen before in peacetime, and it puts considerable restrictions on our daily lives. According to the instrument, the regulations are made in response to the serious and imminent threat to public health, which is posed by the incidence and spread of coronavirus in Scotland. And I don't really need to explain much of what that is. Presumably anyone that's been awake and paying attention knows the scale of that emergency, the imminence of that emergency, the threat that that poses to public health. So that's the justification for these measures. Now, the law has 11 regulations, 11 parts, so to speak. If you click through to that link on the legislation.gov website, you can see them and look through them. And then there are two attached schedules, almost like appendixes at the end. So I'll try to explain generally what all these different parts mean one by one, and hopefully I can do it in a way that's understandable to the now 15 people watching on my screen, an incredible amount of people, 13 more people than are allowed to meet outdoors in a gathering at any one time. So if you're one of those people and you find this interesting and useful, and you know someone that might want to watch this now, please share the link, click the like button, subscribe to the channel below, and you'll see sort of reoccurring content that we're doing on this. And it will also record. So at the end of the recording, if you found any of it interesting or important, you should be able to then come back later once it's fully uploaded and share this information. So first of all, Regulation 1 at the top of this statutory instrument. And this is about when the law comes into force. So it says that the regulation comes into force immediately after they are made, which was Tuesday night at 7:15 p.m. And it also says that these regulations apply in Scotland. So that's fairly simple. 10 more to go. Now, Regulation 2 is important. This explains how long the emergency powers in the law will last and how they can be stopped. So it states that the Scottish ministers, that's the legal name for the Scottish Government, politicians, and those who act for them in the civil service, must review the law at least once every 21 days, and the first review of these powers must take place by the 16th of April. So that's not very far away. Under Regulation 2, Paragraph 3, the Scottish ministers have the power to publish a direction terminating part or all of the law if it's no longer necessary for public health. So why is this information here? It's because the powers I'm about to outline, closing businesses, restricting our right to leave where we live and meet other people, are huge power grabs that go against swathes of conventional human rights assumptions and the usual assumptions we have about the relationship between the state and citizens. So it's right that these powers are time limited and require careful and regular scrutiny. And so that's why there's this time rule about reviews, and why it also has the power to terminate part or all of the regulations. Now Regulation 3. So these are the rules on what premises and businesses have to close during the emergency period. This is when the law can sound a bit technical and hard to understand because there's a lot of cross-referencing going on. So in paragraph 4 of Regulation 3, it says that you'll find the places that have to close automatically if you're in Part 2 of Schedule 1. So you can see straight away how this can be a bit of a muddled maze of information. But what that means in effect is if you go down to the bottom of the law, on pages 10 to 11, there's a list. So in Part 2 of Schedule 1, it's the formal name for it, there's a list of lots of public and entertainment venues. So those have to close. Unless, under Regulation 3, you are within the exception for some of those premises that you can use it to broadcast performances. So things like this, if it was a certain type of venue that was used for performances or public spaces, you might have the right to use that premises for broadcasting certain things over the internet. So the premises and businesses largely dealt with are food and entertainment venues. Any premises for consuming food and drink on that premises alone have to close, but takeaway services can still run. So that could include cafes, for instance, doing just takeaway work alone, but no longer serving customers in the cafe. Regulation 4 is also about restrictions on businesses and more rules for closure. So in paragraph 1, it says that anyone carrying out a business has to make sure there's physical distancing between people on the premises, with the exception of carers and people in the same household who are from the same household. So this refers to a list in Part 3 of Schedule 1, so that's once again at the bottom of the law, which includes lots of vital services, so places you can get food like supermarkets, pharmacies, banks, post offices. So all those businesses that continue to run now have to operate physical distancing between people on the premises. That's the sort of 2-metre rule. Paragraph 2 of Regulation 4 is, if anything, maybe the most consequential law and part of this law in relation to businesses, because it says that any business not listed in Part 3 of Schedule 1, and that's the kind of vital businesses, must become a delivery or online business for the purposes of sale. So that's really far-reaching, because it means basically any non-vital businesses can operate normally anymore. They have to close, or they have to work with social distancing and no face-to-face custom. So that basically, that law, from my sort of reading of it, would close down any non-vital businesses that aren't covered by Part 3 of Schedule 1 for face-to-face custom. So you can continue to run if you're doing that business online or by delivery. So some businesses might adapt to that, but that's a huge change. Paragraph 4 says that any business of holiday accommodation must stop business. Paragraph 6 and 7 states that any place of worship must close, except for following reasons, which are funerals, broadcasting an act of worship, or providing essentially voluntary services, as long as there's also physical distancing in that place of worship. Talks about community centres in paragraph 8. So they also have to close except for essential voluntary activities and as long as there's physical distancing. So you can see that that's a reoccurring theme for any public spaces, for any businesses, for any places where people might be in larger numbers of more than a couple. And it specifically mentions food banks, homelessness support or vulnerable people support, and blood donation as examples of what essential voluntary activities can mean in a community centre. Paragraph 9 is about crematoriums and burial grounds, and it says that any person responsible for those types of venues must ensure it's closed to the public except for funerals, and at those funerals there must also be physical distancing. So that's again quite a serious restriction on something that's quite an emotional part of people's liberty, people's personal rights, which is quite a serious and obviously upsetting thing for a lot of people to contemplate. Regulation 5 is the regulation that will have the biggest impact on all of us. And Regulation 5 is about restrictions on movement, personal movement. And it probably has the most important line in the law, something you could have never imagined being the law of Scotland until maybe the last month. And that's in paragraph 1 of Regulation 5. And that states, except to the extent that a defence would be available under Regulation 8, paragraph 4, during the emergency period, no person may leave the place where they are living. So that's quite a incredible line to read in a piece of legislation, and it's something that has to be read quite carefully. No person can leave the place where they live during this period, that is the emergency period, except where there is a defence under Regulation 8, paragraph 4 of this regulation. So you can see you've got essentially a blanket concept, a blanket ban on the right to leave where you're living, and then it's got an added exception where there's a defence and it refers you to another part of the regulations to read. But we have to think a little bit more about what it means to define a place where you are living. So in paragraph 2 of Regulation 5, it defines that as not the simply like the walls of your flat or your house. It says that it includes your garden, a yard, a stair, a garage, an outhouse, or other sort of extension of the premises. And paragraph 3 of Regulation 5 makes clear that this general restriction on movement doesn't apply to a person who's homeless, which you can think of would be a rather sort of nonsensical restriction to impose on someone that doesn't have a place to live. So at this point, it makes sense to jump down through a few regulations and go straight to what those defences are for reasonable cause for movement. And that's at Regulation 8, paragraph 4. And that says where the defences for leaving your place where you're living begin. And so paragraph 4 states that it's a defence. A defence is when the person has a reasonable excuse. And those reasonable excuses, so-called, are then listed in paragraph 5. And this is really long and gives many examples, some of which you'll probably already be familiar with. So you can leave where you live to get food or medicine for you or a pet, or to get essential supplies, or to do this for a vulnerable person. So that's already quite a wide set of ideas. So to get food or medicine for you or a pet, or to get essential supplies, or to do any of those things for a vulnerable person. You also have a reasonable excuse if you're taking exercise, if you're seeking medical help, if you're providing care or assistance to a vulnerable person, to donate blood, to travel for work or to volunteer, where this can't be done from home, so where you can't volunteer or work in that form from home, to attend a family funeral, to attend court, to access critical public services, or for child access arrangements, which will be particularly important for people who obviously have shared custody arrangements already in place, and children still have the right to move and travel between homes and to be accompanied in that process. It also gives the right, if you're going to as a minister of worship to a place of worship, if you're moving house, or to avoid injury, illness, or harm. So there's quite a long list of what the statutory instrument called reasonable excuses. So those are the key reasons for why you can leave where you live. And it's worth noting that this is different from some examples of just guidance or opinion put forward by politicians who have advised or suggested or put forward the view to limit the amount of times you leave your house for exercise, for instance, to once a day, and to avoid leaving your house as few times as possible, or few instances, even for these reasons for which you're allowed to leave your house. But this statutory instrument doesn't limit the number of times you can do each of these things in a day. And it doesn't strictly say that you have to stay indoors. If you go back to the precise definition of what it says no person may leave the place where they are living. The place where they are living. And that, as Regulation 5, paragraph 2 defines, is slightly wider than simply staying indoors. So that might be a useful thing to understand if you are someone right now who's particularly stressed, who's particularly worried about whether you can just step a foot outside your front door, or go into like your own garden or something like that for a breath of fresh air, whether you're a stickler for wanting to do exactly what you think you're being told from one source or another. There's not a time restriction in the statutory instrument, and it's not strictly that you have to stay cooped up indoors. It says you have to stay where you're living, which kind of a reasonable understanding means generally staying indoors. So that's paragraph 5, the key paragraph in Regulation 8. But now to jump back up to Regulation 6, this is the regulation about gatherings. And again, there's a general rule and then exceptions. So the rule is that during the emergency period, no person shall participate in a gathering in a public place of more than 2 people. Something, once again, that was unimaginable until fairly recently. So the exceptions to this are when those people live together. If you're in a household of more than 2 people, it would make sense that sometimes you might go outside as a group. To be in a gathering for essential work, for a funeral, or where reasonably necessary for a house move, to provide care, for emergency assistance, or legal proceedings. And those are all the reasons available under Regulation 6. So Regulation 7 is about enforcing these rules. And it says that a relevant person may take necessary action to enforce these rules. What does that mean? It's defined in paragraph 12 as a police constable or someone designated by the local authority for this purpose. But local authority representatives can only enforce Regulations 3 and 4, which are the regulations on businesses. Paragraph 3 gives police the power to direct people who are outside to where they live or move that person there. And paragraph 4 gives the police the right to use reasonable force if necessary in the exercise of the power. Paragraph 9 gives the police powers to disperse gatherings of 3 or more people and to remove people. So you see, those are quite wide-ranging, something that, once again, would have been quite unimaginable until recently, giving the police quite blanket powers to shut down and move people and use force if there's a gathering of more than 2 people. It's quite a serious change in how we consider the relationship between the police and the public. As I've said, it's subject to review. It's subject to its first review in mid-April, and subsequently has to be reviewed at least every 21 days. So we'll just obviously have to wait and see how those reviews are undertaken, and have questions about on what basis is sort of proportionality being applied here. Obviously, at the moment, for the next few weeks, when there's fears about the outbreak reaching a peak, people seem currently to be accepting those restrictions on sort of personal movement and personal liberty and gatherings. But obviously the question in the future will be, for how long is it reasonable to maintain these quite stringent controls on people's rights? So the powers to enforce those restrictions are in Regulation 7. Regulation 8 then defines offences and penalties. What happens when you break the rules? So if you're breaking the business rules, the personal movement rules, or the gathering rules, all those are now an offence. Obstructing someone trying to enforce the regulations is an offence. So that means obstructing either someone in the police or someone designated to enforce the rules by a local authority. That's an offence. Someone refusing to follow direction to enforce the rules is an offence. So if you refuse to follow police instruction or the instructions of a relevant person as designated by a local authority, that's an offence. But these offences are again subject to the reasonable excuse defence in paragraph 5 of this regulation, regulation 8. So if you have one of the reasonable excuses as defined, then you're obviously not committing any of these offences. So that's obviously the important thing to understand. Paragraph 6 states that a person who commits an offence is liable to a fine. And paragraph 7 states that if a business commits an offence with the consent, connivance, or neglect of an officer of that business, then they are liable to be prosecuted. So this means that a company director, a secretary, or an officer can be liable for the actions or omissions, form of like if a form of neglectful omission of the actions of their business. So this is important relating to any businesses that don't follow the rules. They could be employers forcing people to come into work when they're a type of work that could be done from home, because we read that that's part of the requirements. It could be a business that's not enforcing physical distancing on its premises. It could be a food premises that's still selling food to be eaten in. It could be any number of types of premises which fall foul of that, and this allows the law to apply an offence of the business to an officer of that business. So it could be someone that runs the business in one way or form as a director. So that's quite important. I should say at the moment, I'm just checking the chat because I've never done this before. If anyone has any questions about anything I'm saying, please just post it in the sort of chat bit on the sides. First time we've done this, so it's a trial and error. And if I have any ideas or anything helpful, I'll try and say. Obviously, this is just a general run through of one piece of legislation. No one's an expert on this, so it's all quite new. And obviously, some people who are very well acquainted with statutory interpretation could be far more detailed about this and could do so for hours. But this is just going to go on for another sort of 5-10 minutes after this. Then I'll take any questions. So yeah, if anyone has any thoughts, please post them and I'll get to them at the end. Yeah, so that's important because it brings in responsibility for business directors for the acts, something that's done with their consent, connivance, or neglect. Regulation 9 is a bit more specific on the penalties for anyone who commits these offences. Paragraph 1 gives an officer the right to give a fine to someone over the age of 16. Police can fine people for breaking these rules. Paragraph 3 states that the first general penalty is £60, so it's a financial penalty. But under paragraph 4 of Regulation 9, that penalty is reduced to £30 if it's paid within the first 28 days. So it's a reduced fine if you pay it quickly. Paragraph 5 then states that repeat offenders pay more. So if you commit an offence under these regulations for a second time, and then a third time and a fourth time, the fine then increases. So if you were a repeat offender for your first repeat offence, you would be fined £120, then £240, then £480, up to a maximum of £960. And it doesn't say exactly what happens if someone was just still refusing to comply at that stage, but you'd have already paid a hell of a lot of money. Just off the top of my head, you're talking about towards £2,000 if you'd committed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 offences in total, which is obviously a substantial financial penalty that has a degree of inequity about it, depending on who was fined that amount of money relating to someone's ability to pay. Regulation 10, the penultimate regulation, provides some further important definitions. So the definition of a vulnerable person is anyone over the age of 70 years old, a pregnant person, or any person under the age of 70 with an underlying health condition. And examples of what constitutes an underlying health condition are given in Schedule 2. And some of those are what you'd expect. That's not an exhaustive list. It's a list of examples of underlying health conditions. If you look in the sort of piece of legislation yourself and go right down to the very bottom, I think it's page 11 or 12, you'll see that list of examples. And why is it important to understand what a vulnerable person is in this piece of law? It's because the reasons for which you're allowed to leave your house include various forms of help to a vulnerable person, as set out in Regulation 8, paragraph 5. You can see sort of to provide food, medicine, essential help, to provide care, all these things. So someone going to provide those types of help to someone over the age of 70, to someone who's pregnant, or someone with an underlying health condition has a reasonable excuse for doing so, for going out to do that. And so they wouldn't have committed an offence if they're providing any of those forms of support to someone who is in that category. So the final regulation, almost done, is Regulation 11, and that states that the regulations expire 6 months after coming into force. So this means late September 2020. So this puts some form of automatic expiry date on these regulations, once again important for human rights purposes, for just restrictions on the power of the state and the relationship, the powers of the police, all these things, given their right to intervene is quite extreme compared to what we've ever seen in our lifetimes. It's seen as a form of scrutiny to put an automatic check on the time period of which they apply. Of course, under Regulation 2, as I explained at the start, parts or all of these regulations can be removed earlier if decided upon by the Scottish ministers on an ongoing basis. They have a right to do that at any point, at any earlier point. So that's something to bear in mind. And that's regulations 1 to 11 of this Scottish statutory instrument. If you were looking through the instrument in front of you, below Regulation 11, you would then see the full schedules that I mentioned. Schedules 1, I think parts 1 and 2, and then Schedule 2. And that would give you that information too. So I hope that was useful. Hope you've heard me okay. I have no idea. Obviously my laptop's muted because I would hate to hear myself on a feedback loop just going round and round in my head. So hopefully the audio was okay, the visual was okay. Any feedback on that? I've just been using a laptop, so it's fairly basic setup. And now I'll just quickly go and check if anyone's posted any questions. And see what people have said. More Migrants Organising for Rights and Empowerment. Great name. Would it be possible to provide an easy read version of the legislation? There might be. I've not seen one myself. Usually, certainly like acts of the Scottish Parliament, for instance, are accompanied with explanatory notes and certain forms of explanation. I've not seen any easy read notes for this legislation. It was brought in quite quickly. Even if you look at the legislation itself, right at the bottom on page 13, there is essentially a single paragraph and then 3 sentences of explanation explaining what it is in simple terms. But it's really, really short. So that's one form of easy read access, but it doesn't really explain it in full. In some ways, this half an hour description is me trying to make it accessible, trying to make it a kind of easy description of the ideas. And the general advice from government is another form of sort of easy read advice. And I think that's why, of course, there's a discrepancy between the general advice from government agencies and what the legislation actually says, because they want people to understand the information. So they'll explain it as saying, stay at home, stay at home. Only leave in emergencies or for necessities. And that's a really easy way to explain it to people, rather than going through all the information. Close unless you're a vital business. Only go to work if you can't work from home and it's essential work. And these are very short, in some ways, like easy read or easy explanations, which is obviously why the government communication is quite different from communication about the legislation. So I'll keep an eye out for that, but I've not seen any sort of easier versions apart from what I've just read out. Someone's asked, is it the responsibility of the business owner to enforce the social distancing policy? So if we went back to what I read out, I think that is in just find it. That's in Regulation 8, paragraph 7, and so essentially yes would be the answer from that source. That yes, it is the responsibility of like the business owner um, to enforce the social distancing policy, or to close, or to not operate as a public shop, depending on how they fit into the different types of business organisation, and that creates a form of liability for the business's behaviour onto the director, secretary, or officer of the business. That might not necessarily be the manager of the business, but the director of the business will be is the information publicly available on Companies House for incorporation. Good to know, this is from Colin Miller, good to know about there being no statutory limit to time or frequency of visits within the defensible reasons to leave the home. Yep, that's important. I saw some people asking straight away when this came out about dog walking, which maybe, I don't have a dog, I don't have any pets, but if you don't have a dog, you might not appreciate why that would be an important thing. But I sat and thought about it for a while and realised how vital that might be for someone's personal mental health, and for just treatment of their dog, and their dog being allowed to go outside and go for a walk and not basically climbing up the walls. And so from my reading of this, there's no restriction on taking your dog for a walk twice in the same day, for instance. And hopefully people knowing that, the more people know that, the less stressed and worried they'll be about it. Is there any limit to the distance from the home that can be travelled in pursuit of the defensible reasons to leave the home? Not in this statutory instrument, no. So I think, certainly from what I've read about in some other countries, there was discussions about certain kilometre limits on travel. That's not mentioned here, so that's quite important. But I think, obviously, we're still waiting to see exactly how it's implemented by the police on the ground, and I imagine there'll be cases of dispute over that. So, for instance, if your reason was exercising, is it acceptable to go to drive somewhere to a scenic place, as has been one of the issues of controversy, and then go for a walk up and down that hill? It doesn't seem to be explicitly banned by this, but there might be a question of reasonableness about whether that constitutes reasonable behaviour of taking exercise. It's not explicitly banned, but I suppose it might be a question about a broader reasonable behaviour of whether it's taking exercise. For instance, if you're driving somewhere, it's issue of complexity, and I think they're obviously hoping that most people act in a reasonable, like normal way in terms of how that's implemented or what people do. Someone's asking, is it lawful to drive my son to and from his office, online retail, where he'll be working alone in order to save him using public transport? That's from Rab. That's a really tricky one, because the question wouldn't be about your son, because to understand these types of questions, you would go back to Regulation 8, Paragraph 5, and that's where there's this long list. So if you click on the link that I posted right back at the start in the chat, this is where there's all these long lists of reasonable excuses for leaving the house. And so within that, you can travel to work if the work can't be done from home, and isn't sort of public facing, and is like an online point of sale. So that means your son can, presumably, not knowing all the details, but from that reading, seems like could be allowed to go to work, depends on the circumstances. The question would be, can you drive him there, though? It's slightly more complicated, because there doesn't seem to be something in the sort of list of examples or excuses that allows you to drive someone to work, because I suppose for you that's an example of you going outside and doing some form of travel. So I think when it says travel for work, it would mean the work being undertaken by you as an individual, rather than you taking someone else to work for them. Let's just see if I go back to what exactly it says. To travel, so these are excuses for the person, and it's the need to travel for the purposes of work. So I think it depends upon whether you read to travel for the purposes of work as meaning for the purposes of you working, or for the work of your son. who you'd be taking to work. So really, there's a bit of a risk there. I think if you were to be driving your son to work, but it could be arguable that that's an acceptable thing to do. It's not completely clear from just reading the law by itself, which is really difficult. I think these are all the kind of difficult cases that it throws up by having such a giant change overnight when we're not exactly sure what the interpretation will be in practice. Someone says, are there any restrictions in using an allotment? I think that's from Mark Pearson, the rather glib answer to that is it depends what type of allotment you're talking about. It depends about whether it's the garden connected to your sort of flat or property, and therefore it's part of where you live. It's like almost like a back garden, which might be fine as long as you're obviously not there with more than one other person and you're social distancing and those kind of things. Or whether you're talking about some kind of collective public allotment, which is not part of where you live, and therefore you're just going to visit that allotment, and then it would get very complicated if you're asking the question why you're visiting that allotment. Are you going there to collect food, which might be acceptable given that you're allowed to leave where you live to get food, or whether you're going there to do gardening, which isn't named as one of the reasonable excuses. Whether gardening or like watering or planting things as part of leaving your house for food is a bit complicated, and so I think it would depend on the details of that. Colin Miller says your mic was a bit quiet but very clear. A-okay, that's good. That's better than nothing since it's just an internal mic rather than an external mic set up. Some of the stuff we've done before, if plug while some people are watching. The interview we did recently with Dr. Kirsty Hughes in the Scottish Poetry Library, if you look through our sort of past videos, that was done for proper sort of 2 mic setup and sort of proper camera equipment and stuff, and was a lot better because we had all that equipment linked in. But now we can't go out and meet people, so have to do it from the living room. Susan Gard Petty, I recognise that name, is happy that holiday lets can't function at the moment, particularly controversial in Edinburgh where I am. J.A. Murray says, thanks Michael, enjoy your Twitter account, keep up the good fight, brother. Thanks, I will. Rab points out that son lives with him, yeah, which makes sense. I think that's one of the tricky things that people will have to judge, is particularly if it's hard for someone to get to work, and if they could only get to work before because they had access to public transport that often has been shut down, or they're advising people not to use public transport. So yeah, it's a difficult one. Susan Gard Petty points out what I said again about allotment being a form of food, and so there you go. That's good. James McFarlane says the UK government has said that they would consider allotments acceptable with social distancing. That's cool. We'll see what Police Scotland says though. Hopefully they're feeling sympathetic to allotment users. And that's all the comments that I can see. And there's been a consistent around 20 people watching this live, which is 20 more people than would have listened to me if I'd just spoken to myself in an empty room. So that's an acceptable start. Hopefully it's not been too worrying or fretful an experience. Hopefully it's been like productive and some people have like heard some useful things, because that's me finished. No one else has posted any questions. So hopefully that's been useful to some people to have a read through. And once again, if you want to look at what I've been talking about yourself, it's at the very top, the first comment I posted, the links to that. So we're hopefully going to try and do some more interviews, or do some interviews through this software in the coming weeks, if we're all stuck indoors for a long period, and be posting more sort of videos. So if you subscribe to the channel, that's great, and you'll get updates. I think there's like a little bell that you press as well that gives you automatic updates if you have a YouTube account. And you can follow us on Twitter and Facebook. It's at the Skotia, spelled for K, Skotia. And you can also follow stuff we're doing there, and hopefully we can share more sort of useful information in the weeks ahead. Mark says thanks. Thanks, Mark, for listening. And thanks to everyone else. Quick one from Rab before he goes. Quick one. If stopped by police not wearing masks, is it acceptable to ask that they step back 6 feet? Yes, I'd imagine it would be. I'd very much hope that police will be doing physical distancing when they're doing their work. with everyone they meet. Certainly, when I've been out for like a walk or a jog in Edinburgh, everyone's been very, very careful about um, just even walking down the pavement and things like that. So I imagine like the police will be doing that too, and we'd certainly respond to anyone asking about it. Susan says, thanks. I'm sure your talents will be needed more and more as the truth of what's going on unfolds. Peace and sustainability. Brilliant. Cool. Yeah, thank you to everyone for listening. Something else I've never done for the first time. How do I make this live stream stop? How do I make sure I'm not here forever more? I think if I click stop streaming, that might be the end. It's a clue in the button. Thank you, everyone, and see you soon.